Helping families who lost loved ones to acts of homicide. Two new Illinois House bills look to bring justice to unsolved murder cases and give clarity to those who are still healing years later.
In an attempt to hold criminals and the justice system accountable, State Rep Cam Buckner calls for a change to homicide investigation laws. 23 News reporter Jake Pearson talks to State Rep and Rockford Police Officer John Cabello, who says it may not be possible.
The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act would allow families to request a re-review of 3-year-old unsolved cases. And the Homicide Data Transparency Act would require law enforcement to publish how many homicides resulted in an arrest or charge.
Way too many people in this state know the pain of being on the other side of that gut-wrenching phone call.
Attempting to provide families with answers for the murder of their loved ones. But is the challenge too great once the trail is cold?
There's so many, unfortunately, cold cases. I'm not sure that it would be actually feasible to do that.
Illinois State Rep Cam Buckner introduced 2 new House bills.
The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act, the Homicide Data Transparency Bill.
The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act would allow families to request a re-review of murder cases that have gone unsolved for 3 or more years.
If approved, it would trigger a new investigator, a complete analysis of the case, and the modernization of the case files.
Requiring law enforcement to regularly publish how many of their homicides resulted in arrests and charges. That's what the Homicide Data Transparency Bill will accomplish.
This is a much more straightforward way than the opaque and often manipulative clearance rate metric that we use today.
State Rep John Cabello says re-reviewing that many cold cases isn't practical.
The manpower is just not there. If there's no new evidence that comes in, what is the point of continuing to re-review a case?
From 1965 to 2022, more than 50,000 homicides were committed in Illinois. Nearly 33,000 have gone unsolved, according to the Project Cold Case.
Thank you, Jake. And Buckner has said the 2 bills are important to him personally.
Yeah, his uncle was killed in a 2015 shooting. His uncle's killer was convicted of 10 counts of murder, but not till this year on February 2nd, 9 years after the killing.